Ukrainian drones breached layered Russian air defenses near Daetsk Airport, disabling key systems and striking a major Shahed assembly facility.
At 7:40 a.m., the first wave of Ukrainian Beaver drones accelerated toward the Shahed assembly complex on the outskirts of Daetsk Airport. Reaching the target itself was never expected to be difficult. The real challenge was cutting a viable flight corridor through one of the most layered air defense zones in the region. Russian operators detected the drones almost immediately, and the tracking lock followed within seconds. That lock was not a failure of stealth. It was the opening condition Ukrainian planners had deliberately engineered. 3 Beavers lifted out of a shallow ravine northwest of the approach line and were met by fire from a Tor Air Defense system positioned several kilometers ahead. 2 missiles erupted from the tree line and curved sharply toward the lead drone, forcing its operator into an immediate dive. The Beaver dropped to near ground level, threading between drainage channels as control latency surged past 300 milliseconds. 1 missile failed to follow the abrupt angle change and buried itself in the dirt nearby, while the second passed overhead and detonated close enough to momentarily distort the video feed. Behind the lead drone, the other 2 Beavers broke formation and scattered, forcing the Tor crew to divide its attention. All 3 drones remained airborne, but telemetry revealed something more dangerous than a simple missile engagement. A steady radar sweep had begun. The Tor system was operating exactly as designed. It did not need a clean visual track, only the subtle frequency shifts created by spinning propellers reflecting radar energy back to the antenna. By feeding constant command link corrections to its missiles, the Tor could guide interceptors directly onto a target. The Ukrainian operator understood this and stayed low, where radar reflections from the ground distorted speed and position estimates. Flying that low came at a cost. Battery levels dropped faster than planned, and every meter of altitude sacrificed reduced endurance for later phases of the mission. Then the Tor crew made a critical decision. Instead of pausing to reassess, they launched their remaining missiles in rapid succession, emptying the magazine in seconds and lighting the horizon with exhaust plumes. This was the moment Ukraine had been waiting for. The Tor guidance system could only maintain precise command links with 2 missiles at a time, and saturating the airspace overwhelmed its ability to update them accurately. All 3 Beavers climbed briefly to around 15 meters, high enough to escape the worst of ground clutter without becoming easy targets. Overloaded guidance channels struggled as the drones shifted profiles. For 2 seconds, the Beavers flew straight, long enough for the Tor computer to commit to intercept calculations that assumed predictable motion. Then all 3 dropped back to the deck at once. Missiles tore through empty air, slammed into the ground, or lost guidance entirely and arced away harmlessly. The Tor launcher was now empty and would require several minutes to reload. As the Beavers pressed forward, the Tor crew debated whether they had scored a hit, unaware that all 3 drones had simply vanished back into the terrain. That confusion mattered because air defense responsibility was already shifting upward. A Buk M3 system positioned farther back began sweeping the corridor with deliberate search pulses, building a more refined picture of what was moving toward the airport. Unlike the Tor, the Buk did not rush, choosing instead to observe, refine, and prepare. The Ukrainian operators felt the change immediately. Interference no longer came in sharp spikes but in rolling waves, each one signaling that the Buk was beginning to learn their flight path. As the lead Beaver slipped behind an abandoned gas station, the operator checked his battery level. It remained workable, but it was falling faster than expected after the earlier evasive maneuvers. By now, the second wave of Ukrainian FPV drones should have been launching. Their task was simple and unforgiving: destroy the Tor before it could reload, or the corridor would collapse before the mission truly began. Stopping was not an option, and flying straight was just as dangerous. The Beaver moved again, re-entering the Buk search pattern, knowing the next phase would determine whether the corridor stayed open or disappeared entirely. If you want to understand how layered air defenses begin to break under coordinated drone pressure, continue watching. At 7:46 a.m., the Buk M3 battery fully committed to the corridor, its radar rotating methodically as it refined tracks inherited from the Tor sector. Unlike the earlier engagement, there was no rush to fire, because the Buk crew was focused on observing speed changes, altitude shifts, and heading stability long enough to justify a clean intercept. Ukrainian operators felt the difference immediately through their control links. Instead of sharp interference spikes, the signal degraded in steady waves, forcing video compression systems to work harder with every radar sweep. Each pass meant the Buk was learning where the drones were headed, not simply where they had been. The lead beaver stayed low through an industrial strip, sliding behind concrete walls and fuel tanks that offered no true concealment. Each obstruction mattered only because it forced the Buk system to recalculate velocity and timing, introducing small errors that accumulated with every adjustment. Tracking never disappeared, but its refinement slowed. Behind him, the second beaver operator reported rising latency caused not by jamming but by constant error correction. Radar energy saturated the data link, forcing the onboard processor to spend more effort stabilizing the feed than managing flight efficiency. The third beaver struggled even more as static increased around power lines and metal pylons crowding the route. The lead operator guided his drone beneath high-voltage lines, using towers and cables to create brief radar shadowing. For a drone this small, even partial masking mattered, and the Buk's track confidence slipped from solid to intermittent. That degradation drew attention further back in the defense network. At the Daetsk Airport perimeter, the S-400 command post began cycling radar modes in an effort to fuse incomplete data into a usable picture. Designed to track ballistic missiles and high-altitude aircraft, the system was ill-suited for drones skimming rooftops at highway speed. Inside the command vehicle, operators sorted through returns from vehicles, birds, industrial heat plumes, and civilian movement, struggling to isolate genuine threats. As the beavers edged forward, telemetry briefly stabilized. The lack of aggressive interference suggested the S-400 could see activity but lacked the precision needed to authorize a launch. That calm was misleading because every kilometer closer reduced reaction time for all remaining defenses. At 7:51 a.m., the second wave arrived as 6 Ukrainian FPV drones surged in from the northwest at low altitude. Their operators had been tracking the Tor reload timeline precisely, knowing the launcher would soon regain firing capability. The FPVs split into divergent profiles, some hugging the ground while others climbed just enough to strain the Tor's processing limits. The Tor turret slewed rapidly as targets appeared from multiple directions, overwhelming automatic selection logic. By the time the crew attempted manual overrides, the geometry had already collapsed. One FPV struck near the missile feed, detonating inside thin armor, while a second impact beneath the turret ring severed control cables and froze the mechanism mid-rotation. Smoke poured from the vehicle as the crew abandoned it, removing the Tor from the fight. The response was immediate, with 2 Buk missiles launching from concealment, their motors flaring through the haze. Built for aircraft, not small drones weaving through buildings, one detonated early while the other passed close enough to destabilize a beaver without destroying it. 4 FPVs remained airborne, which was enough. The Buk had revealed its position, and unlike the Tor, it could not reload or reposition quickly without exposing itself further. The surviving FPVs regrouped briefly behind a collapsed structure as operators assessed missile count and radar orientation. 4 drones then accelerated directly toward the Buk radar mast, spreading laterally to force target prioritization. While the radar tracked all of them, the crew could only engage a fraction of the threats. At the same time, 3 additional beavers approached from the rear quarter, exploiting a partial blind spot created by the system's own structure. For several seconds, the Buk crew had to choose. When the radar slewed toward the rear threat, forward tracking lapsed just long enough. The lead FPV dove into the exposed array, collapsing the transmitter housing and igniting internal systems, while a second strike at the mast base ensured the damage could not be repaired in the field. Without radar guidance, the Buk's remaining missiles were effectively useless. The crew abandoned the vehicle as additional drones struck the chassis, and the corridor briefly narrowed before opening again, now missing another entire layer of protection. At 7:58 a.m., with both the Tor and Buk layers neutralized, the S-400 system became the final barrier between the drones and the Shahed complex. The system was never meant to fight alone. and its operators now faced the task of covering low-altitude threats with sensors designed for targets hundreds of kilometers away. Inside the S-400 command vehicle near Daetsk Airport, radar screens filled with overlapping returns, vehicles on nearby roads, birds lifting from industrial rooftops, and heat plumes from factory vents all blended together, forcing operators to make judgment calls with incomplete data. The Ukrainian drone telemetry reflected the confusion. Control links stabilized, interference patterns flattened, and video feeds cleared in a way that suggested the system could see movement but could not classify it with confidence. That clarity was a warning rather than a relief. The S-400 did not need perfect tracking to be dangerous. It only needed enough certainty to coordinate, delay, and deny access until other defenses could recover or reposition. As the Beavers held outside the airport perimeter, Ukrainian operators prepared the next phase. This was not about destroying launchers first. It was about removing the brain that allowed the system to function as a unit. High above the engagement zone, a Ukrainian Ram 2X loitering munition had been circling quietly for over 20 minutes. Flying at altitude and well outside the immediate threat envelope, it had remained invisible amid the clutter of larger radar returns. At 8:03 a.m., the munition began its descent. It did not head toward missile launchers or radar arrays, but aimed directly for the S-400 command post itself, the vehicle responsible for coordinating every battery in the sector. The command post radar finally achieved a firm track as the munition passed below 500 meters. By then, the engagement geometry was working against the defenders, with interceptors requiring distance and time they no longer had. Inside the command vehicle, operators had seconds to react. Some reached for evacuation procedures, while others attempted to force a last-second solution that never fully formed. The Ram 2X struck the roof directly above the primary processing bay. The explosion was compact but devastating, destroying computers, severing communications links, and plunging the vehicle into silence in an instant. Across the sector, the effect was immediate. Individual launchers retained local control but without centralized coordination. Targeting quality collapsed and engagement authority vanished. The Ukrainian operators saw confirmation through their telemetry. Signals smoothed further, and interference disappeared almost entirely, indicating that the S-400 had lost its ability to direct fire. With the command post disabled, the remaining launchers became isolated assets. 3 Beavers moved in from outside the perimeter and struck one launcher and its associated radar, ensuring the system could not recover even in a degraded state. At this point, the air defense network protecting the Shahed complex no longer functioned as a system. Nodes were burning, blind, or disconnected, and reaction times had stretched beyond usefulness. What followed was not chaos, but control. Before any drone entered the cleared corridor, Ukrainian commanders initiated strict airspace deconfliction procedures to prevent friendly interference. The corridor was divided vertically into defined layers. Beaver drones were assigned a mid-altitude band. FPVs were restricted to low-altitude runs, and loitering munitions held above, each group flying only within its assigned envelope. This discipline mattered. With dozens of drones operating in close proximity, a single mistake could have caused collisions or signal interference severe enough to undo the entire operation. At 8:09 a.m., the first Beaver crossed into the Daetsk Airport perimeter. The Shahed warehouse came into clear view, a rectangular structure with a curved roof and heat signatures blooming from ventilation points along its sides. Those signatures indicated activity inside. Whether assembly, fueling, or battery charging, the implication was the same. The Beaver descended rapidly from its assigned altitude, accelerating as it dropped. Through the camera feed, the operator could see Russian personnel moving between buildings, some pointing upward, others raising rifles. Small arms fire posed little threat at that speed. The greater danger was the structure itself and what might happen when it was breached. The first Beaver struck the roof at a shallow angle, penetrating the thin metal skin before detonating inside the main assembly area. The initial explosion was modest, followed seconds later by a violent secondary reaction as materials inside ignited. The shockwave rippled outward, distorting air and smoke across the compound. 2 additional Beavers were already inbound as debris and pressure filled the airspace. The second operator maintained control long enough to drive his drone through a ruptured wall section, adding its payload to the fire spreading inside. The third Beaver was thrown off course by the blast, recovered briefly, and then struck an intact section of the building to ensure complete structural failure. Flames surged through the warehouse, and the heat signatures collapsed into a single expanding mass. From above, the compound no longer showed organized activity, only uncontrolled combustion. The corridor remained open, but the mission clock was nearing its limit. At 8:12 a.m., the destruction inside the Shahed warehouse was still unfolding, but the Ukrainian operators could not linger to observe it. Fires and secondary detonations were visible across multiple camera feeds, yet the focus shifted immediately to maintaining the corridor long enough for confirmation and orderly withdrawal. The absence of organized air defense did not mean the sky was safe. Local units on the ground were already reacting, firing sporadically at anything airborne and attempting to re-establish communications with higher command elements that no longer answered. Ukrainian operators began spacing their drones deliberately, increasing lateral separation to reduce the risk of mutual interference. Each movement was measured because even without radar guidance, stray fire and debris posed real hazards in the congested airspace. Smoke rising from the warehouse created its own problems. Thermal turbulence, distorted video feeds, and forced flight computers to compensate constantly, adding strain to batteries already near planned limits. The remaining Beavers adjusted altitude within their assigned band, keeping clear of the thickest smoke while staying low enough to avoid drawing attention from distant observers. FPVs that had survived earlier engagements were ordered to remain clear, conserving power and minimizing signal congestion. At 8:15 a.m., telemetry confirmed no coordinated radar activity across the sector. The S-400 launchers remained silent, their isolation evident in the absence of data handoffs or targeting spikes. This silence did not mean the threat was gone. Mobile short-range systems could still be repositioned, and man-portable missiles remained a possibility if the drones overstayed. Ukrainian commanders monitored the corridor closely, watching for any sign of new emissions or movement that suggested a recovery attempt. None appeared, but the margin for error was shrinking with every passing minute. Inside the compound, the warehouse roof had partially collapsed. Structural failure spread inward as fire consumed stored components, producing intermittent flashes that suggested further internal detonations. The operators noted the change in heat patterns. What had once been discrete points of activity had merged into a broad, unstable burn, indicating the facility was no longer usable for assembly or storage. With confirmation achieved, attention turned fully to extraction. Drones nearest the perimeter were instructed to begin egress along staggered routes to avoid converging paths. Battery levels dictated the order. Units with the least reserve departed first, climbing gradually to clear obstacles before dropping back into low-altitude profiles that reduced visibility from the ground. At 8:18 a.m. a brief spike appeared on one operator's signal monitor. It was not a lock, only a transient disturbance, likely from a mobile radar searching blindly without coordination. The drone altered course slightly, using buildings and terrain to complicate any attempt at visual or infrared tracking. The disturbance faded without follow-up. Across the corridor, similar adjustments were taking place. Operators communicated continuously, confirming positions, spacing, and timing to ensure no overlap compromised control links. The discipline imposed earlier during deconfliction now paid dividends. Even under stress, every drone stayed within its assigned lane, preventing confusion at the most vulnerable stage of the mission. As the last Beaver cleared the outer industrial zone, the scale of the damage became clearer. The warehouse continued to burn unchecked, with no visible effort to suppress the fire or secure the site. Russian ground units appeared hesitant, moving cautiously at the edges of the compound but avoiding the central area where heat and debris made entry dangerous. There was no sign of immediate recovery operations. By 8:21 a.m., the corridor that had been carved so carefully began to close naturally as Ukrainian drones dispersed back toward friendly territory. The gap no longer needed to be held, only exited cleanly. The airspace over Daetsk grew quieter, not because the danger had vanished, but because the window for effective response had passed. What remained was aftermath, assessment, and the understanding that rebuilding would take far longer than destroying. By 8:25 a.m., the last Ukrainian drones had cleared the engagement area, and the airspace over Daetsk settled into an uneasy calm. Smoke from the Shahed warehouse continued to rise, visible from kilometers away, marking the end of a coordinated operation that had unfolded in minutes but would have effects lasting far longer. Inside the compound, the destruction was comprehensive. What had been a functioning assembly and storage site was now a collapsed structure surrounded by heat signatures too intense for immediate recovery, with secondary detonations still echoing intermittently. For the Russian air defense units in the sector, the damage went beyond lost equipment. The Tor launcher was destroyed, the Buk system rendered blind and abandoned, and the S-400 battalion stripped of its coordination when its command post was eliminated. Rebuilding that layered defense would not be simple. Replacement hardware could be delivered, but retraining crews, restoring integration, and re-establishing confidence in the system would take time and resources that could not be replaced overnight. From the Ukrainian perspective, the operation demonstrated a pattern that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Low-cost drones, when used deliberately and in coordination, had forced high-end air defense systems into mistakes they were never designed to recover from. The success was not about a single strike or a single weapon. It was about timing, pressure, and forcing defenders to reveal themselves layer by layer until the entire structure collapsed under its own complexity. As assessments continued, analysts on both sides would dissect every moment, from the first Tor engagement to the final descent on the command post. Each lesson learned would shape the next encounter, because neither side could afford to assume this outcome would repeat itself unchanged. What remained clear was that the balance between offense and defense in the air was shifting, not through overwhelming firepower, but through coordination, patience, and the disciplined use of systems that exploited the smallest weaknesses at exactly the right moment. If you want to follow how these tactics continue to reshape modern air defense and what they mean for future conflicts, consider subscribing and staying informed.